Welcome back to the full B6.4 1/10 scale team associated buggy build. For this build, I'm going to be completing bag 2, which is the chassis and front end assembly build. As you can see, there's a lot of parts in this bag and a bunch of parts on the trees. So yeah, let's jump right into it. I was just gonna show you guys really quick for these trees. I come in here with these end cutters and I get as close as I can to the edge of the part, and then I clip them off and get as close as I can and clip them off. And then you just feel the edge here. And if there's still a slight bump on it, then I would come in here with a hobby knife and just trim that smooth. That one's actually really good. But so I'm gonna take all of these parts, and you get these trees left over and you can just throw them away. I'm gonna come in and I'm gonna trim all these parts. And I'm going to do it off camera, and we'll come back and then we'll get started with this build. All right, here we go. Got the trees all cut, and I also laid out all the screws. It really helps me to lay out the screws by pan head and flat head and by size. I just find that when they call out certain items, sometimes in the manual, Team Associated can make mistakes on the screw sizes, and this helps to make it more obvious. The other thing you can do is typically the screw sizes get corrected online, so you can also check online for the latest manual. Anyway, let's get started. So the first step here in bag 2 is assembling the bulkhead and the front end onto the chassis. And just to note, this is the carpet or high traction chassis, so it's a +3 mark right here. And it is slightly different than the 6.3. They actually have cut into these sides here and here. They found when leaning that these edges would drag on the high traction surfaces, and so they've cut that down, which is kind of cool. It'll help a little bit with more consistent handling. So yeah, anyway, the first thing is putting on these caster or kick-up inserts on the chassis, and the car comes with 2 plastic ones, a 0 and a 2.5. The standard kick-up angle here is 22.5 degrees, and you can use the 0 to stick with that setting, or you can use the kit supplied. You can see there's a plus and a minus 2.5, and so whatever way you point the arrow, you're going to get plus or minus on this. And then as well, they also make optional parts, which is down here. This is the optional plus 2.5 minus 2.5 steel bulkhead. They make, actually, I believe the brass has been discontinued, but you can still find a brass version of this, which is essentially almost the same weight as the steel. This is a plus 30 gram part. But the steel holds up a lot better, so that's why I'm using steel. And then they also make an aluminum one, and depending on the setup, how much weight bias you want in the front end, those would be options. For me though, I'm putting this steel one on, and I am going to do the plus 25, so that plus 25 is going to point forward to achieve that. And yeah, we'll put that on. And it uses these, you know, there's these flathead screws here, and it's the shorter of there's 2 here that are 16 and then 4 that are 14, and it's those 14s, and they go in to this bulkhead assembly that we built from bag 1. So you can stick this thing, these little bosses stick into those holes, and then we put this bulkhead on like so, and then these screws go in on the back 2 screws to hold this all together. Yeah, and these screws, they should go in nice and straight. The bulkhead, the way things are set up, it's somewhat kind of self-aligning. Just make sure you confirm it, but it should be relatively easy. And again, you don't have to go crazy tight. Just want to cinch up all the gaps. Nothing rattling around. You can kind of see how tight I'm going on the video. Okay, so we got that in, and just check steering and everything feels good. So we got that on. All right, next step here is putting on the chassis weights, and the side guards, and the battery little rubber pads. And these screws are super small, so I'm going to do that next just to kind of get them out of the way. And you can see these weights, they're marked with a weight side and a non-weight side, and I like to have those weight markers go up, and so we'll do that like so. And it uses this 1.5 wrench, and you're going to want to use thread lock, and it doesn't require a ton of thread lock for these little screws. I don't know, you probably can't really see that, but just a little dab of thread lock. And just be careful, you don't want to cross thread these screws. They should go in without any resistance. Everything's pre-threaded already. And you can see here I got like a ton of thread lock on that one. If you do that, just wipe it off with your finger. Like, you don't want to put too much thread lock on these, because it's really, if you do want to take them out to adjust them, etc., if you put too much on, you can strip them out pretty easily. And then, like, I'll come up here and wipe off if there is any excess as well. All right, so we got the weights in. And other thing to note is they actually increase the size of this electronics weight to give you a little more footprint, to where you can put your electronics on here and pull this off to take your electronics out. So that's kind of cool. So yeah, the next thing here is we're going to put these little pads in here, and I like to just kind of look at them in here to get an idea with how much play these have, and they're actually pretty tight fitting. It just kind of helps you align. So you just pull this backing off and try not to touch it. I'll just push it against the back there and push it into place. I like to do these before I put the side rails on, because I just find that it's easier to get them in when those side rails aren't in the way. So again, push to the back and then slide them in. And then just push them down like so. All right, so then the next step here is the side rails. They go in like so. And there are these little other foam pads that they actually can go right in here. And it is actually easier to put these on when these rails are off. But some batteries need them and some don't. And so you almost need, to check this, you can kind of lay these out and put your battery in here. Let me go get my battery and we'll do that. All right, so here we go. We got these side guards laid out. And just look at this battery. And mine fits in without these little rubber things, so I'm not going to install those. But you know, this is a good check to do beforehand. And you know, just check that out and add them if you need to. And you can put them on later, it's just a little bit harder. Okay, so now we're going to put the screws in, and the trick here is you want to notice that there's actually two size screws. So these here are 10 mil screws, and there's the 4 in front that use 10 mil, and then these are 8 mil, and there's 2 on the left side, roughly here and here, and 3 on the right side here, here, and here. And this back screw goes in later on the left side for the fan installation. So just don't overlook that there's different screw sizes. So we're gonna start that with one of these. We'll start with one of these 8 mil screws. Straight, you can back them out and put them in. But yeah, so we're just gonna, I like to put 2 in first so it kind of squares everything up, and you might have to leave all these loose until you get them all in, just because of the number of holes you're trying to align. But again, you're going into plastic, so these don't have to be super tight. I mean, you want them snug, but not tight. Like, not like gorilla tight, I mean. Okay, so we got the smaller ones in here. All right, so once you get the side rails on, then the next step they have you do in the manual is to install the servo. And I can tell you, I'm not going to show it on this video, but it's important that you plug this servo in. You know, I have a car and I just plug it into the receiver with a speed controller set up, and you power this servo on, and then you want to center, you want to remove all the sub trim and main trim from the steering channel, and then put the horn on as straight up and down, so 90 degrees like this as you can get it. And tighten everything down, and then if it's not perfectly 90 degrees, then you're going to take sub trim and use sub trim to bring this to 90 degrees. And the other part of this that's important is when you put this thing in, you're going to have to check that it's steering the right direction. And if it doesn't, you'll have to do servo reversing, and you'll have to flip that sub trim. So if you had to do, like, let's say you had to do right 50 and you find out it was going the wrong direction, then you're gonna have to actually go to left 50 and do servo reversing. So just keep that in mind as you go through this. And I can tell you that for my setup, you know, I had this in a B6.2 before, and so it's the same setup. And I do have to reverse my steering servo. So keep that in mind. If you have Sanwa, I would just reverse it. That should be correct. If you don't have Sanwa, then you'll have to figure that out. Probably going to be reversing it as well, though. And so then for the first step in the manual is putting the servo saver on, and they give you these plastic ones, 23, 24, and 25 tooth. Most servos are 25 tooth, so more than likely you'll use that. And for 10th scale two-wheel drive, these plastic ones, they do work pretty well. But I always like to use an aluminum one for high traction just to make sure that you don't have an issue. And I'll put in the description the servo saver or the servo horn that I'm using here. But if you do end up using the plastic, just don't forget to use this ring. And so you put this ring right on this end here of the servo. If you forget that ring, you will strip out your servo horn and have a problem. So don't forget that metal ring. And then, you know, you put the screw in the end here, and for this one there's also a screw that tightens it down on the spline, and this screw here I like to put thread lock, and I typically don't thread lock this end screw. And then, you know, from there, the next thing we would want to do is put this ball on the servo horn. And because I'm going with aluminum, I'm going to use some thread lock. If you use the plastic one, you could skip the thread lock step. So yeah, we stick that in here like so. Okay, and then the next thing they have us do is build this turnbuckle link for the servo. It's these little things here in this. And you'll see that this has a 1.5 millimeter tip on one side. You can't put it on this side, just on the one side. And so I know where the center is, so I kind of get them threaded in the same amount. I like to take a gray Sharpie and put a mark on the center. So you can see here that just put a little, I put like a little mark that's somewhat on center. And then you just screw this thing into this ball joint and be really careful that you get it in straight. And then with that center mark in there, you can get this thing in center, and then you put this little, they give you one ball stud washer because they want 1 mil between them. So you stick that in there, and then you just thread this other side. Making sure you get it all straight. Sometimes I find servo dependent, you might need 2 millimeters, and so we'll see if my servo falls that category, man, this thing is hard. That category or not. And these ball cups need to be like 90 degrees from each other. So I just loosened it just a little bit to get that 90 degrees. So we got that built. And then the next thing they have you do is put this servo mount together. And there's these little pegs that stick up. And so those go into there's little holes in here that those go into. So you just use one screw on those. So and yeah, it's these small ones here that we use for that. And again, because we're going into aluminum, we're gonna use some thread lock. Put this together like so. That one on there. Grab this one. I think that last little shorty screw there, it was intended for the servo horn, so we won't end up using that because my servo came with one. And if your servo comes with one, I would just use that, because then you know it should be the right thread and the right length. You just make sure you get enough length. If not, you can try that one, but just make sure it's the right threads. So we got that all put together. And now the next part of this here is you put this piece on, and it looks like it goes, you know, all right, so then we'll put the second one of these on here, and before you do, I would feed this wire through this hole. Otherwise you're going to struggle to get that on. And actually it's this one. So we'll feed that through like so before we put that on there. And then we can screw this one on. And I already put thread lock on this screw, but don't forget to put thread lock on that screw. But you can see the screws are on the back side of the servo. Okay, so then the next thing here is you put this thing in. And I'm just noticing that this, you can see here that the wire, actually you kind of have to push it a little, which, I mean, isn't a huge deal. This is ever so slight, but I just wanted to look at how this thing lines up. To this other one. Ideally, you would want this to be as straight as possible when it's centered. And so they put these little spacers in here, and I'm going to cut these off the tree, and I'm going to actually use those and see how it looks. And you know, every servo is different, so you have to just try this based on your servo. So let me pull these off and we'll give that a try, and I'll come back. All right, so for my servo, I put the spacers in, and I think I like, they slip right in between the blue here and the servo, and they go right in there. And for mine, I like it, so I'm gonna leave it that way. And then you use these kind of large head screws to secure the servo onto it. And again, because we're going into metal, I'm going to use a little thread lock. And I did one side already, but we'll do this side. And I will say that there's not a ton of thread engagement because I'm using the spacer. I'm gonna have to watch that. I think it's gonna be okay, but definitely have to watch that. I wish there was a little bit more thread engagement. And these, you still want to be careful that you don't strip them, but because we're going into metal, you can go just a hair tighter than you might normally with the plastic. So we got that in there. All right, so the next step here is screwing this servo down. And as what I can tell you is it's really critical to loosen this top screw and these two screws and push this block as far over next to the servo as you can. And if you don't do that, it makes alignment down here really difficult. And so you're going to need to make sure you do that and maybe check that whole alignment to make sure it looks good before you start screwing this thing down. And my whole alignment was still slightly off when I did that, and so I had to kind of push the servo out and get the screws to feed in from a little bit of a distance to minimize that gap. But I did, as you can see, get this thing to work. So you're just gonna have to be a little bit careful with that. And you can see now that I'm pretty good on alignment now. All right, so I got some pliers here. Before you secure this down, I would recommend just kind of making sure this horn is at 90 and putting this on here and making sure that you're pretty close to center. Depending on servo horn and servo, you might have to adjust this length for them to be centered. But the 1 mil was actually good for me. So pop that on. And then for this one, I'll just take a nut driver, pop it on like so. And once you pop this on, just make sure this thing, you can see here, make sure everything moves freely and make sure. Actually, it's interesting that actually hits, although I have a feeling that's more than full steering, so we'll have to check. I hope you guys saw that. This hits here, right down there. So we'll have to check to make sure that I get full steering. I think I will. Okay, so after the servo installation, the next step, here's this bag is putting in the sway bars. They go in this area here. And the setup that I'm using, I'm setting this car up for AstroTurf at Die Hard. And I'm not going to use a sway bar, so I'm going to skip this step. But if you do put this in, the biggest thing is you want to make sure you get this collar, this black collar centered on this bar. And then you put these blue items flush with the end of the bar. And you know, once you put this on, there's these set screws that go in these holes, and you want to tighten these set screws and feel the bar, and you will tighten them until the bar won't move, and then you loosen them until you can freely move that bar. And you do that you do one at a time. So tighten this one until it barely snugs on the bar and you're struggling to move it, and then back it out until it's free. And then you come over here and you do the same with that one. So that's overall how the sway bar works. Okay, so the next step here is we're gonna put this top on. And before I screw it down, I always like to move the servo and make sure that everything fully clears this top part of this. And you can see, hopefully for mine, that it does clear. It's a little hard to see it, but it definitely clears. And so you just want to make sure that you have clearance in both directions, and I do. So yeah, the next thing here is we're gonna put in these panhead screws here that go in the top, and they're the 14s, which are 14 millimeter long, which are these ones here. And it uses the 2 millimeter hex driver. Get these started in here, and then we'll pull out the DeWalt. And then snug them up by hand. Feels good there. And yeah, and then the 10s, which are these, go up front. And again, these are all going into plastic, so no thread lock required. These ones kind of go in at an angle. We stick these in. I'm gonna hold this. All right, so we got that in there. Again, I'm gonna skip these set screws since I didn't put the sway bar on. Hopefully I don't regret that later when I want to use it, and I hopefully can still find them. But yeah, so the next step here is putting on the A-arms, which these A-arms, there's a shock mount right here, these holes, and so that points back. And there's even a little right here, you can see that L, which is for left, and that one has an R, which is for right. So we'll stick those in like so. But actually, before I do, there's these little teeny panhead screws that actually go right in here, and they hold the one side of the hinge pin from slipping out. I'm going to stick these in. It's going to be way easier to stick those in now. So we'll stick those in. Just make sure you get them in straight. Okay. This little piece right here goes in between the arm, and you can see there's like a rounded edge and then like a sharp edge, and the sharp edge actually points towards the chassis, so it goes in like that, sharp edge towards that block. And then once you get that in there, hopefully you can not knock it off. And I don't know, it's hard to get this in the view, but you can now put that arm on and slide it through all of that stuff. And then same with the left. Stick the arm on and slide it through. And so once you get these in, you just want to make sure these arms are fully free, which they are. Okay, so we got those arms on. Just so you can see here, the metal plate, you know, it goes inside on the front part of the arm. And then if you're using the optional plate that I put in, the steel kick-up adjustment, it comes with these 4 set screws, and you can actually use those to further secure this hinge pin in place. And if you're using the plastic ones, they have one spot here where you can do the same thing, but you'll have to get those screws. They don't come with the kit, but the metal ones do come with it. So anyway, it's not a necessity. It's kind of like almost like an additional fail-safe. But as what I'll tell you is, when you put these in, you should be a little bit careful because it can make the arms tighten up, and you want those arms to be free. The suspension's going to work much better if you have free arms, so you just need to watch that when you put these in. I put them in one at a time and check the arm after every time. And you'll notice I am using thread lock as well, just getting some off of a little pool that I put in the table here. Yeah, this arm is a little tight, so I'm going to back this off and just kind of push the arm forward. There we go, it's much better now. So yeah, just as you put these in, make sure you're getting it to move. And sometimes I won't run these because the tolerances are such that I can't get them to be free, and I would rather have free arms. But yeah, these all feel really good. Okay, so I did notice they actually changed this for the 6.4, but the 6.4 does actually come with the 2 set screws for these blocks So I'm going to set those aside because I don't need them since I'm using the steel one that came with its own. So yeah, the next step here is to put this bumper on, and it sits kind of keyed in to this block. And then it's these longer flathead screws, the 16 mils that go in. And these do go into plastic, even though you start off with metal, but they're into the top part, which is plastic. So no thread lock required here. This bumper, I noticed, can be a little bit sensitive if you don't over tighten it or it starts to warp. But this bumper actually, if you didn't use the set screws, it holds the front part of the hinge pins in place as well. So always check everything for movement after you assemble stuff and everything is working good. So the next step here is putting on this shock tower. And you'll notice the shock tower on one side down here, it has countersunk holes, and then on the other side it doesn't. And so those countersunk holes point forward, and then you're actually going to build for the shock tower, and these point aft. So these studs for the shock point aft. Okay, and so these long screws are for the shocks, and the kit setup as well as the setup I'm using, I'm going on the outermost hole. So we're going to thread those in. Normally those are clearance holes. Yeah, this one's a little better. This one's a bit tight, so sometimes you just have to work them in by threading them. Okay, and then I like to put a little bit of thread lock kind of like right down there and down. Oh, that was a lot of thread lock. Let's get that off there. But I like to thread lock these in because when you take the nuts off of the shocks, these can try to loosen up on you. And so I like to put a little thread lock. It's not absolutely required, but I just find it makes life a lot easier if you do it. So you guys can decide if you want to do that. I would recommend it. All right, and then the final thing to tighten this is I use a crescent wrench to hold these. You know, if you have a socket that fits in there or something else, you can use that. I think it might be 6 millimeters, 6 or 7. But I use a crescent wrench for that to tighten those down. Alright, so once you got these shock standoffs, then this little weird looking thing plugs in on the same side as the standoffs point. And you push it in to the tower like that. And then this piece covers everything up. The shock screws. And then you take these smaller little pan head screws and you thread them in here. And all this is to protect your tower from getting worn from the carpet, and it also, the carpet owner tracks really appreciate because it prevents you from ripping up the carpet. Okay, you don't have to crank that down, just snug. So we put that on, and yeah, the final step here is sticking this in, and we got this is a front wing mount, and it's gonna go on the top holes. So yeah, this thing goes on the top holes like so. So this flat part, yeah, this points down. And if you use the wing mount, then make sure you put the bottom screws in first, because you won't be able to get to them once you put that wing mount on. Honestly, this ball stud seems to be in the way of putting this screw in. Which is, let's see if I can't get it in. Alright, so yeah, if you are using this inner camber link hole, you're going to have to take those back out to get this bottom screw in. You know, the instruction manual tells you to do that first because they use the outer holes, but if you're using the inner hole, you're going to have to take them out. And then if you're using the wing mount, you're going to use these 14mm screws, and if you're not using the wing mount, then you'll use these shorter 10mm on top. But I'm using it, so we will put that in like so. So we got that in. We'll check the tightness down here, and those feel good. So now I'm just gonna stick these ball studs back on. I'll do that off camera. All right, so we got those ball studs back in, and you know, just to recap, we have this screw. I have it left over because it's for the servo horn, and I had my own. These two set screws were for the plastic to secure the hinge pin. I didn't use those. These two are if you don't use the wing mount, so I'm not using those because I am. Okay, so then these final two screws, I do not believe these were the same screws I used to put the shock tower protector on, and maybe these get used later, but there's no need for them in the instruction manual, so I'm going to put those aside as well. So that concludes bag 2 of this build, and I hope you will continue to tune in for the rest of this build. And if you like this video, please like and subscribe.